Good afternoon and welcome to today's virtual town hall meeting. My name is Chanda Gallego, your moderator for this town hall. In studio, we have members of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and they include Mr. Ralston Henry, filling in for the Director of ESO. We have Ms. Mahreen Nabi, representative of the Business and Professional Women's Club. We have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, chairperson and previous chair of the 2015 committee. We have Ms. Catherine Welds, independent employee representative, and last but not least, Mr. Shomari Scott, past president of the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce. That being said, I now hand it over to our committee chair, who will give us the overview of the committee in terms of reference work done to date, as well as the deadlines that they're working towards.
Thank you very much, Sandra. On behalf of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, let me say how pleased we are for the opportunity to present this virtual town hall on the work of the committee. Let me begin by saying that the committee were appointed by the Cabinet of the Cayman Islands government in accordance with the provisions in the Labor Act. The appointments began at the end of January 2023. We have been meeting weekly since that time, and we have now clocked up 30 meetings to date. Our terms of reference is to examine the feasibility of the current minimum wage and to determine whether there's sufficient justification in our economy now to justify an adjustment to the $6 an hour minimum wage, which was established 7.5 years ago. Much has transpired in the Cayman Islands during the last 7.5 years, and we haven't met anyone who has not agreed with us that it is overdue for a review at this time. So having agreed that it is overdue for a review, we set about our task of gathering some data and receiving presentations from all the major stakeholders in our economy. And from that information, we hope to arrive at relevant conclusions that will guide us to a new possible minimum wage. Of course, we are advisory only, and the government reserves the right to accept or otherwise deal with the recommendations that we will be making. So our decisions are not final. Also, it's worth noting that we're not starting from scratch, but we're building on the work that was done 8 years ago, and that work is referred to as the 2015 report. That report is available online, and I encourage members of the public to take a look at that because that report laid the foundation for what we'll be discussing today. We've divided up our work into various sections, and we are now engaged in what we call the public consultation phase of our assignment. During that time, we've been conducting public meetings, radio interviews, town hall meetings, focus groups, and other means of communicating and receiving feedback from members of the public. So this is an opportunity for you, the public, to further engage with us and for us to have an opportunity to speak to you as members of the public and to guide our deliberations in a meaningful and hopefully productive way. So we look forward to our discussions with you today. Joining me on my right is the chair of the subcommittee that we've appointed, and her name is Mahreen Nabi. And the subcommittee that she leads is the subcommittee responsible for research and methodology. Her committee has been hard at work providing us with information and feedback from all of the surveys and research work that we've undertaken. And this work is critical to the work that we're trying to do as a central committee. So let me now turn it over to Mahreen, who will explain further about the work of her subcommittee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hurlston. The subcommittee, that is the Research Methodology Subcommittee, is composed of myself as the lead and a set of 4 other members of the committee, including 2 of whom are here today, Mr. Shomari Scott, Ms. Catherine Welds, Mr. Phil Jackson, and Ms. Tanisha Williams. The goal of the subcommittee was to work with the Economics and Statistics Office to ensure that when we did a public outreach campaign, we were able to get the most widespread, most transparent, and comprehensive data that we could in terms of what public opinion was on the matter as to what the next minimum wage should be and what some of those considerations should be that we should look at in this process. The work that we've completed, Mr. Hurlston has spoken to some of it, but we did do a set of 5 surveys that were looking at different targeted groups: business employers, business employees, household employers, household employees, and those who are unemployed and underemployed as well, to ensure that we got the most widespread set of information. We also had in-person town halls for Grand Cayman. We're having one in Cayman Brac next week. And of course, having the opportunity to have this virtual town hall. And we have, as I'm sure and I hope many of you have engaged with, had social media campaigns running where we have solicited your opinion via the survey, but also via your commentary on those campaigns. With the assistance of the ministry, we've also facilitated an organizational stakeholder survey, which had us get feedback from groups such as Rotary, Lions Club, the Cayman Islands Legal Practitioners Association, and also heard from major employers in sectors on island who had a lot of the lowest paid workers in their workforce. We also did a focus group with young Caymanians who are in the process of either seeking employment or upskilling. So what are some key data points that I can share today? I would like to share some with you, but I also want to say that this is just to lay the foundation of what will be covered comprehensively and fully in the report that is due out in September. For the focus group that we held, we had 20 brilliant young Caymanians who are in the middle of upskilling and seeking employment. The consensus from all of them was that we needed to increase minimum wage. However, their main concern was that if it was raised too much, the burden of cost increase may fall to young Caymanians, either through increased grocery prices, rent, and those young Caymanians expressed that they were having a hard time already getting a foothold on independent finances and housing options. When discussing what they felt would be a sufficient starting minimum wage, they instead opted to offer that while a minimum wage is important, what was more important for them was a clear path to increase that wage on a regular basis with hard work and consistent performance. They highlighted that this was clear in more professional industries like accounting, law, fund administration, but could seem very clear and arbitrary in some sectors that they had some interest in, which include tourism, hospitality, and some trades. Moving on to some insights from the surveys, we were very grateful that over 5,000 people responded to our set of surveys. 60% of those who responded identified themselves as Caymanian, and 40% identified as non-Caymanian residents. The vast majority of all of those who were surveyed agreed that the minimum wage needs to be increased. Results were also consistent that the objectives of this change should, in order of importance, first, increase the pay for the lowest paid worker, second, decrease the exploitation of workers who are paid less than a fair value for the work they produce, and third, allow Caymanian workers to meet their basic minimum needs. Overall, the top factors that were identified by the public as considerations in determining the dollar value for the new minimum wage were cost of living, business or household's ability to pay without adverse effects on the employees or the employers, the workload of employees, and the skill level and experience of employees. 4 out of the 5 groups that were surveyed all aligned on a median dollar value that they felt would be comfortable to suggest as the new minimum wage. The standalone recommendation of a lower median dollar value came from those who were household employers who felt that given that, unlike with businesses where cost impacts can be mitigated in a variety of ways, an individual family would bear the full burden of an increase in any amount on their family budget. I will leave you with those data points for today. We are continuing to engage, and I would like to encourage you to continue to send your feedback either via our social channels or to minimumwage@gov.ky. We are still taking all opinions and thoughts on this matter as we consider final reports. And I will hand it over now to Mr. Hurlston Henry of the Economics and Statistics Office to provide some more insight on some quantitative data points.
Thank you, Maureen, and good afternoon, viewers. Let me first apologize for Mr. Adolphus Laidlow, the Director of the Economics and Statistics Office, who unfortunately could not make this town hall today. The ESO sees its role on the committee as an impartial arbitrator, guided by the data that protects both employers and employees. To this end, we believe that the process of determining the minimum wage must be guided by a balance between both sides of the coin, and for all intents and purposes, the makeup of the committee dictates that, and even the panel here today. As you were introduced earlier, we have representatives from both employers, employees, and as well as various groups. To that end, the ESO has sought to provide different estimates and different analysis that guides or looks to protect these particular groups. To date, we have done 2 initial presentations to the committee that seeks to determine at the bottom of the spectrum what is an acceptable minimum wage for the lowest paid or most vulnerable individuals. This was guided or was based on a national living assessment survey done in 2014, which is the only poverty estimates that has been done in Cayman Islands to date. We have inflated that estimate up to 2022, and it suggests that the minimum or the vulnerability line in the Cayman Islands, which is the minimum that persons can afford the basic needs on, is roughly $6.44. We have therefore suggested to the committee that any minimum wage must be above this basic floor. And so that was the initial presentation done by the Economics and Statistics Office. Recognizing that this protects the employees, we have also looked to see what is the ceiling, noting that the higher the minimum wage, the more burden it would put on employers. And so we've looked at who are the more vulnerable industries that are employing or are largely labor intensive. And we have looked at those industries to see what would be a stress point in terms of wage that would lead to a disruption in the economy. And so in that sense, our 2 core presentation has been to kind of give the committee a quantitative guide as to what the floor for that minimum wage would be and what the ceiling would be to not disrupt the economy. The ESO considers its core role on this committee to protect the fabric or the core fabric of the Cayman Islands economy, and we believe that that range allows the committee to have a quantitative idea as to how to balance both spectrum. Since then, we've done additional presentations on differentiating between the living wage and the minimum wage, which has come up as a particular point of interest, where persons believe that a wage should allow them to enjoy a particular standard of life. As a committee, we have had to grapple with balancing or understanding that core difference between a minimum wage and a living wage. The minimum wage which the committee is mandated to come up with or to define or recommend to the government is enshrined in law and must balance, as I mentioned before, both employers and employees. A living wage, for all intents and purposes, is purely concerned with maintaining a standard of living for individuals. And so while the wage is there, it's secondary to the standard of living. Now, by defining a standard of living, we inadvertently excludes the employer because we're just focusing on what the employee needs. And so because of that, a living wage cannot be enshrined in law because it could unduly affect the employers. So it's key that we recognize that difference and focus on what the committee is mandated to do, which is recommend a minimum wage. So the ESO has done a research and made a presentation on that and the differences between the two to the committee. We've also done 2 surveys, one on employers and one on household employers. And so both surveys, we've produced the results and presented to the committee as well. Moving forward, the ESO will be, as the committee continues its deliberation, looking at the impact of different wage proposals, primarily on how it will impact inflation, layoffs, output, and the most vulnerable businesses. So we'll continue to work with the committee to ensure that the fabric of the economy is protected as we come up with the best possible minimum wage. And with that, I'll pass you on to Mr. Shomari Scott.
Thank you, sir. And I probably should have gone before you because things that the Chamber recommended in that final report you just addressed as well. But just to say good evening, Cayman Islands. And I only have 5 minutes, so my executive committee from the Chamber made sure to give me points so that I don't take more than the 5 minutes, and I'll do my very best. So we're a membership that has over 525 members, which has 18,000 employees within the Chamber umbrella. So what we actually did when we first heard that there was going to be a minimum wage discussion back in 2022, we started surveying our membership. We started having discussions with the members of our executive committee and otherwise that represent stakeholders throughout the business community, as well as we got submissions more recently from different focus groups that we actually held. The Chamber more or less did a dissertation of all of the points on a position paper that we would like the minimum wage committee to consider. And what I did is just pull some excerpts from that so that we're not here all evening. But the first thing is that the Chamber strongly urges the government to conduct an economic analysis to evaluate the impact of any increase in minimum wage. Within, it should be an assessment of the impact to each stakeholder, but most importantly, Caymanians and permanent residents, an assessment of the likely impact on the consumer price index, inflation, and other economic indicators, a detailed description of strategies and resources to be directed at enforcement, because anything we decide is only as good as the enforcement that comes thereafter, and a full account of the research and analysis conducted by Ministry of Labor and Pensions work and my good friend there, Economics and Statistics, that demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the long-term benefits to the island's economy outweighs the costs and risks. So that's where I said you actually did such a wonderful job outlining that at each point, the Economic and Statistics Office will make sure we know what the potential impacts are so that this committee has the best information at hand to give that advice thereafter to Cabinet. Now, it's an emotive topic, and you can look at it from both sides of the pendulum, and there are arguments that are presented in favor as well as against the minimum wage, and we at the Chamber just took a few snippets of first the arguments for an adjustment in the current climate for minimum wage. And the first one is the adjustment of minimum wage would improve conditions among low-paid and unskilled workers in the Cayman Islands, providing them with increased disposable income to address the increased cost of living since the implementation of minimum wage many years ago. Another point is an increase in the level of wages offered for unskilled jobs may increase the attractiveness of such jobs to Caymanians who may otherwise continue to search for other categories of employment while still remaining unemployed. And I think that's an important point because one of the mandates was, yes, to look at the most vulnerable workers and to ensure that we are putting in a fair wage. But the other part of the mandate was to look to see at what point we could actually incentivize more Caymanians to take up certain jobs at certain levels, which would help to reduce the need for imported labor. So that last point, I think, is important. The counter-argument to an adjustment of minimum wage is that the Chamber recognizes that the adjustment of minimum wage would be met with some opposition, especially when you look at Caymanian-owned micro and small businesses. These businesses are still reeling from the impacts of the pandemic, And since it's anticipated that most workers who are likely to benefit from an adjustment of the minimum wage are work permit holders, the policy would disproportionately benefit non-Caymanians, while the likely downsides of increased prices and goods of services, especially if the increase is significant, would affect all residents equally. This is exacerbated by the common knowledge that many work permit holders regularly repatriate funds overseas, so the additional wages may also not benefit the local economy. And just to make the point that it talks about significant increases that potentially would have that impact, but once again, we have the ESO there with us to make sure that every step of the way we understand exactly what the benefits are and the impacts of each percentage point of a potential increase. And just to briefly pull from two of our members that are owners of small businesses, because when we actually did a survey of our businesses, 14 out of 78 actually stated that they pay their staff less than $10. So that's 17% of the chamber businesses actually pay less than $10, which is more than minimum wage right now. And then obviously the percentage would be much lower. However, we pinpointed those businesses that said that it would seriously impact them, just to understand more in regards to what they would have to say. And just two snippets. One retail business that employs 10 workers said, an increase in minimum wage between $1 and $2 would affect me since I'm already paying around $8 per hour. But if it went to $9 or $10, that would be too much. That would affect everything. I would not reduce staff because we already have a minimum staff as is. Most of my staff work overtime as well. I feel the minimum wage is too low right now and must increase, but not to between $9 and $10. That would affect prices. Another small janitorial business said CI $8 per hour would be okay. CI 9 would be a bit too much. CI 9 would impact the prices and mean I would have to reduce staff. Both of those would actually occur. But $6 is definitely too low. It should increase, and CI $8 is okay, but between $9 and $10 would be too much. So those are just two, just to give an example of where some of the small businesses are thinking. And to the chair's point and to Hurlston's point as well, our committee is comprised of so many different areas that we even have a representative from the Small Business Association, which gave us some very clear indication what small businesses are thinking and what they would want between minimum wage, which is separate to what the chamber also is considering and also put forth to the committee. So in conclusion, the Chamber of Commerce supports an adjustment of minimum wage, but urges the government to evaluate the economic impact of increasing the rate to ensure that the adjustment does not contribute to an increase in the cost of living for residents. Additionally, we support concurrent discussions on how we reduce the cost of various items and cost of living, and what the government can change to control and reduce its operating expenses while focusing on improving education to ensure that we prepare Caymanians to move into the higher paying roles and reduce the stigmas that exist for certain jobs which are also well paying. Based on recent Economic and Statistics Office reports, even though we're looking at the minimum wage, and if it is increased, please note that 61% of Caymanians earn KYD, $4,800 a month or less, and 72% earn less than $6,000 a month. Most do not fall anywhere near the minimum wage threshold. However, these salaries with the present cost of living don't leave much room, for example, for parents to save for education, retirement, and emergencies. And this is just saying that all of the information, which was much more than this, that was given to the actual committee, we believe that consideration of all the factors outlined will assist the Minimum Wage Committee in striking the appropriate balance between addressing the problems that the government is seeking to address and any potential risks that any adjustment may pose to the Cayman Islands economy. And once again, I harken back to that's why it's great to have individuals like Mr. Hurlston and ESO, apart from everybody else that's there, so that it's a scientific approach and we're making sure that whatever recommendation we make is based on data and we understand the impacts prior to doing anything that could upset the beautiful apple cart we have here in the what should I say, cassava cart we have here in the Cayman Islands. And with that, I hand it over to Miss Catherine Wells.
Thank you so much, Shomari. Good afternoon, everyone. As my fellow members have already shared, since we've come together in the end of January of this year, we have, engaged with numerous government departments and entities in order to get a very good overview of the challenges and implications that we as a committee are going to face when we come to our decision to recommend to the government. To give you an idea of some of the presentations that we have received to date, we have had presentations from the Department of Labor and Pensions on legislative overview, gratuity framework and enforcement issues that they're currently facing. We have had presentations from our Economics and Statistics Office, which we've had 4 to date, and that was to cover the poverty and vulnerability line, methodologies for determining a minimum wage, insights into Caymanians affected by minimum wage, and the living wage, as Mr. Henry already alluded to. We've also had presentations from the Needs Assessment Unit on how the financial assistance program currently works, who is benefiting from it, the number of households that are on the program, barriers to employment, and departmental concerns. We've also received presentations from WORC, work as we know it, on minimum wage analysis, and we received insights into jobs that pay minimum wage, the profile of a minimum wage worker, jobs in the industry, and the level of education that comes along with those particular individuals. We've also received a presentation from the Ministry of Social Development on what the Financial Assistance Act of 2022 means and how it affects our minimum wage. And then we've also had presentations from a number of associations, which also include the Chamber of Commerce. We've also had a presentation from the Cayman Contractors Association, who, while you may think, well, what does that have to do with the minimum wage? They do employ a huge number of minimum wage workers and work permit holders, and they are considered, many of whom are vulnerable within our society. And the Cayman Islands Tourism Association, for people who, as we know, are in the service industry and the tourism industry, and many of whom are also vulnerable and have definitely shared a lot of their concerns. To give you an idea of some of the concerns that we have received as an employee representative, I am here to share perspectives from an employee standpoint, while many of our members are representing associations and businesses. Many of the concerns that has been raised from employees and from the public has been that some of them, or many of them, I should say, from a lot of the feedback we've received in our surveys, many are being overworked and underpaid. Many are being required to work 60 hours a week on 40 hours a week pay. Some people are not receiving their pensions. As I'm sure you are aware or may have known in the past, there has been some media coverage on a few employers who have not paid pensions and have had to be brought to justice for those issues. We've had reports from domestic helpers where their passports have been withheld from employers. We've also, on this side from the presentations, we're learning of all of the challenges that the departments responsible for enforcing these issues have been facing. And that is why we felt it was extremely important to receive these presentations so that we could have a wide range and a well-rounded view of the issues and how our new minimum wage could be impacted and what are the implications of bringing that forward. And so thank you very much. I'll pass it back on to Ms. Gallego.
Thank you so much for your overviews, and thank you to each and every one of you members of the public for your feedback and the questions on minimum wage. And speaking of questions, we have a few that we would like to address, and hopefully our panelists will be able to address in full. So we'll go right into it. And I believe the first question that we have here, this is probably a good one. What makes the members of the committee qualified? I
will take that question. Actually, that question is best answered by the Ministry of Border Control and Pensions, as well as Cabinet, because the members of this committee were appointed on the recommendation of the Ministry and on the decision and approval of Cabinet. So I don't think members of our committee should find themselves in a position to have to justify their own appointments. The appointments were made by persons who valued the qualifications and experience of the persons that were nominated for appointment. And so I think we should just leave it at that.
Okay. Another question here. Why is the minimum wage being raised? This may or may not have been addressed before.
You want to take that one?
I think, like we mentioned before, the last minimum wage was implemented back in 2015, as the chair mentioned earlier, some 8 years ago. Naturally, a lot of things has happened since then. There's been inflation has happened, standard of living has gone up, and like I mentioned in the initial overview, the assessment that we did, just adjusting that vulnerability line for inflation, suggests that we have now reached a point where the minimum wage is currently below that vulnerability line. And so that in itself necessitates relooking the wage. And so I think this is a critical point. More so it's probably overdue, as the initial recommendation was that the minimum wage should have been adjusted every 2 years, or at least looked at every 2 years. So 8 years is far overdue, and it is quite time.
Another question from social media. Is the committee considering the exclusion of classes of persons from the minimum wage requirement? And if so, why and who?
Sure. No, and with regards to that question, when we talk about classes of person, there are a lot of different parameters that you can use when you look at that. It can be based on skill level, based on age, based on nationality, whatever it may be. There has been healthy discussion about what the right structure is for the new minimum wage. All of those things have been looked at, but I will say the committee has, and we're coming up with our final recommendation, but there will not be an exclusion based on class in the recommendation that comes out in September.
Okay, we have another question here from Facebook. How can employers feel that it's okay to use gratuity to pay some of a person's basic wage? Why is it that not everyone in Cayman is entitled to the same minimum wage without exclusion? Paid by the consumer and used as a concession for one sector only hardly seems fair. It should only be used as additional income for those in the service industry.
That has been we've also had a lot of discussions on that. That is a very touchy topic for a lot of people, and we have gone into great depths to explore this. Now, the quick answer is that the Department of Labor and Pensions approve gratuity schemes for businesses within the tourism and service sector. So based on those approvals, that is why they're allowed to pay 25% of a person's salary to make up that $6. So if they're paid $4.50, they have to make up the additional, and that was approved through gratuities. We have been questioned on that as to whether or not we would recommend excluding that or continuing to include the gratuity schemes into our recommendations. And at this time, while we're still exploring it, we are very, very cautious of trying to consider whether or not we'd want to upset that or change that, being that the gratuity schemes have been a part of our economy for over 30 years. But we are exploring all options at this time.
Thank you for that. Another question here from social media. This one regarding security guards. Why shouldn't security guards have a different minimum wage when crime and issues they deal with keeps getting more dangerous and worse in our community? They work such long hours and have a hard time making it work, putting their life at risk every day for $6 an hour.
I think that's an issue that we're going to have to revisit, because at the moment there are no extra considerations for security guards as a employment group, we did have a list of potential questions that we could have voted on as a committee. And one of the questions we were voting on was the question of, do we want to impose or to introduce a new minimum wage for a new category of worker in that sort of a environment and industry? And we have not come to a conclusion on introducing any new wage categories or any new wage rates or any separation of anything that is already existing. So I think the public just needs to await our final report and look at our recommendations carefully, because we don't want to prematurely come to a conclusion that is inaccurate. So I think we need to just be a little bit patient and await the report.
Thank you for that. Just a quick reminder that we are live, and we are just ensuring and encouraging you all to submit your questions on the Facebook live stream or via email. That is minimumwage@gov.ky. The questions continue. This one here by email. Minimum wage is mostly paid to work permit holders. Why are we making it easier for people who do not invest into our country to live here while Caymanians are still struggling?
Well, I guess since I'm the I'm the last person, I got the very interesting question to answer. But what you would have heard, even in the Chamber's position, is you always have long-term goals and short-term goals. Now, the goal of, I would hope, the Cayman Islands as a country, from a long-term perspective, is to have our education system at a point that you can never have 100% employment, but close enough that Caymanians never need to look for the lowest paid jobs in order to support their families, and they're able to be skilled, whether through your traditional education or through the trades, that you make much more than whatever the minimum wage would actually be in a country. Because even when we've had presentations and you look at laborers, for instance, from a construction perspective, the majority of them aren't getting paid minimum wage. They're actually getting paid quite a good salary. Just to use the point that I know at times when people think about minimum wage, they may not even realize what categories of jobs fall under minimum wage. Now, the long term, nirvana is that Caymanians will be able to get jobs that are much higher, double, triple what that minimum wage potentially would be. But on the reverse, over in the short term, we need to make sure that there is a fair wage for fair employment, and we're looking at unskilled jobs as well, right? So we have to be careful that we're not overvaluing unskilled jobs that throws the entire economy out of whack. But if we can, using fair scales, increase it over time, such to the point where Caymanians who may be skilled but want to do a certain position are actually able to survive in Cayman at that wage, that's where we should be getting to, but you can't do it in one jump. Because if you do it in one jump, then it's going to impact everybody, and the economy can be in a tailspin. So we just human rights and everything else that's involved, we owe it to ourselves for a fair wage, for fair work, right, which will mean a potential increase, and Mr. Hurlston more or less identified that vulnerability line as well. And we need to make sure we meet it just because it's the right thing to do, but in doing it, have other types of policies to make sure Caymanians earn more. However, increase that over time, that Caymanians will want to do that job so that we can have less imported labor, which is the goal of any country.
Okay. And with that said, a question asked here, how do we differentiate the difference between minimum wage and a livable wage?
I think Hurlston tried to explain a little bit about that. For the first time, when you read the final report of the committee this year, you will see that we are going to spend a bit of time in describing what we understand the definition of a livable wage to be, and comparing that to the definition of a minimum wage. And Hurlston mentioned that the real main distinction between the two is that the minimum wage is enforceable by law. A livable wage is not enforceable by law, but is subject to negotiation between employer and employee. So we're going to spend a little bit of time informing the public as to our interpretation, our definition of a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage, and that will hopefully draw a distinction and make it clear that there has to be a distinction between the two. As Hurlston said, the livable wage is more addressing the question of a lifestyle of a family, because the definition of a living wage is how much does a family need by way of income to maintain a reasonably acceptable quality and standard of living. Now, what might be reasonable to you may not be reasonable to me, and what standard you're aspiring to may be different from the standard that I would be content with. So these are all points that we have to describe very, very carefully and thoroughly so that the public is not confused over the subject of those two definitions.
Thank you for that. A question here, why not have the minimum wage staggered according to education or experience?
Well, the minimum wage has to be, at the moment, it is across the board for everybody, and we are hoping that the majority of people will aspire to move up from that minimum wage as quickly as possible and as quickly as they can upskill themselves and prepare themselves for higher responsibilities that attract higher wages. That's the way to go. And in a democratic society and in a capitalistic economy, that is the way that labor has to negotiate its way up the employment ladder.
This question, could you define what is poverty and what is vulnerability? Vulnerability.
Hurlston, you want to take that one?
I think, like we mentioned earlier, there's only been one real poverty assessment done in the Cayman Islands, which is what we've adopted and kind of inflated. That was done in 2007. And for all intents and purposes, that was a measurement of absolute poverty, which is essentially based on essential food necessity. And so what we did at the time, well, not me, but what was done at the time, was we took from the official food and drug agency in the Caribbean what was the necessary caloric intake for persons to survive on or to get all the necessary nutrients on a daily basis. And from there, we look at what is the cheapest way that persons could get that nutrition based on the goods and services available in the Cayman Islands. So it was basically essentially just looking at food poor, if you needed to survive, what nutrients you needed, and what amount of money would you need to buy that nutrients at a minimum. So that was the definition that we came up with for poverty, which, as I mentioned, is a measure of absolute poverty. And as Chair was mentioning, it conflicts with the concept of relative poverty, because one of the reasons why that report was not widely accepted was that it was thought that some of the foods that were coming out of that were not necessarily foods that fit Cayman lifestyle or foods that were known to Caymanians. So persons were saying, well, Caymanians doesn't eat that type of food, and so that wasn't necessarily accepted. But then we come into the issue of different standard for different living. So based on that poverty, we inflated that food poor by 25% for other items, which gave us a vulnerability line. So the vulnerability line is essentially a buffer on that poverty line that says that once you're at that vulnerability line, there's a chance you could fall into poverty. And so that is where we came up with the vulnerability line, which is just a buffer above that poverty line.
Okay, thank you. A few questions we've been getting hits the point on the benefits of Caymanians. And so a question here is, how is this change going to benefit generational Caymanians, or will it be more for expats?
Well, to answer that question, and Mr. Henry can correct me if I'm wrong, at present we have over 3,760 people making minimum wage and below in the Cayman Islands. 25% of that number are Caymanians. presently to date.
800 to 900.
Correct. So it's not just benefiting work permit holders, and we're trying to, as a committee, we're trying to be very mindful and stay clear of the expat versus Caymanian. We are mandated to look after the most vulnerable in our society, the underpaid, the minimum wage worker. So we are looking to benefit everyone who's impacted or is in that category at present. Yes, we are mindful that minimum wage workers work permit holders make up the majority of that, and they do send some funds home, but at the same time, they still have to make a living when they're here in the country. And so we're trying to protect everyone from being exploited, from being underpaid, mistreated, and that is our mandate. So yes, there will be, absolutely, work permit holders are going to benefit. Yes.
Just to add to that, and Shomari can concur, they're looking at minimum wage as a linear or absolute number that affects one set of persons is completely inaccurate. Mm-hmm. Like Shomari mentioned, the goal is to constantly move persons up. If we have somebody earning a minimum wage, their supervisor is probably $3 above. The minute you move that minimum wage person up by $2, the supervisor has to be moved as well. And so you're going to have a ripple effect going up, and you're going to see more Caymanians being affected. Additionally, the spending power afforded by these persons. It's a well-known fact that the poor spend most of their income on food, clothing, and things like that, which is going to benefit Caymanian businesses. So the impact or the benefit to Caymanian is not just single-fold, they're not making that $6. There's a lot more going in that will stand to benefit Caymanians.
And to add to that as well, adding to what they're saying, is that one of the things that we as a committee have to look at are the hardships that are presently being experienced by workers in the field as a minimum wage workers. So some of the reports the feedback that we've been receiving, especially at our previous town hall, was that before deductions you're getting that $6 an hour, but afterwards you're getting pension and insurance taken out. People are having issues where their health insurance is inadequate to support them should they fall ill. And so with raising the minimum wage, not only, as I stated before, work permit holders will benefit, but so will Caymanians, because everyone deserves to have a good standard of living and be able to seek medical attention, be able to buy food, provide for their families, pay their rent, but also hopefully, as we say, move up into the workforce and earn more, and also afford a home of their own, which is another issue that we've also been told and feedback we've received from people in the service industry as it relates to the gratuities, where while it should be or is reported to the Department of Labor and Pensions on a monthly basis, these, unfortunately, on the pay stub of the employees, their gratuities are not being reflected, and therefore they're experiencing some hardships in securing homes of their own because of this. Banks are requiring that at least 2 years of history showing gratuities being paid, and they expect or want to see your stable and increasing income over that time. So that's why we also hope that, with the increase in the minimum wage, that will also assist them in a better life.
A question here. Many employers would benefit from a staggered approach in increasing the minimum wage over a period of time. Is this something that the committee is considering, or will the adjustment happen all at once?
Again, I think I'm going to suggest that we await the arrival of the final report, because those kinds of implementation decisions have yet to be decided on by the committee. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in that regard.
Okay, thank you with that one. Has the committee considered implications across the board? For example, how this will increase the cost of goods and services, and how this will affect middle-income households?
As I mentioned
The
before,
man of the hour. ESO.
it is definitely something we've considered. It's probably one of the most critical part of what the ESO has to do on the committee. However, as the chair mentioned earlier, that is something that comes in the latter stage of our deliberation as we start to really look at what are the possibilities. Then as we look at those possibilities, then we can simultaneously look at the impacts that come out of all of those. But naturally, we will be looking at how the different minimum wage numbers would in fact impact inflation, would impact job losses, would impact businesses, would impact everything within the society. So that is definitely something we will be looking into quite significantly and should form a detailed part of the report.
Are any recommendations going to be made with regards to improving enforcement?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We believe, based on the information that we have received and heard so far, we believe that compliance and enforcement going forward is likely to become a major challenge. Because in order for the department that is responsible for administering, regulating, and enforcing the labor legislation, resources are going to be critical to that work. And so we suspect that they are not sufficiently staffed and not sufficiently resourced to do the work to the standard that the public is expecting them to do it to. So that is an area that, again, we're going to be making some recommendations to. We'll also be making recommendations for some legislative amendments to bring the legislation more in line with modern labor practices, and that will hopefully help to undergird and underpin the work of implementation and compliance.
And just to touch on what the chairman has actually stated, when part of the mandate is to look at the most vulnerable in our society based on the minimum wage, if we aren't doing a good job, and I say we as in a government and a people, with actually the enforcement of whatever we decide the minimum wage is, then have we truly achieved what the mandate and what the objective of the committee is? And then that's really come to the fore when we're looking at whatever decision we make. There will always be some bad apples and some bad actors, and unless we can ensure that they come into full compliance, we may be impacted, even if it's slightly, the economy, but still not helping the most vulnerable, which that's portion of what our committee is supposed to be doing.
And in addition to that, from the employee side of it, I would strongly encourage the public to understand and learn of your rights. So if you're not work permit holder or Caymanian, it's important for you to know your rights as an employee to ensure that you do not become vulnerable to exploitive and abusive practices of employers. So if you're having any questions, if you do not feel comfortable reaching out to your HR department, you could also reach out to the Department of Labor and Pensions, the WORC, or the Department of Immigration, or someone in the legal practitioners. They do have a group of legal advice practitioners. As far as I know, they meet every Tuesday. I don't recall if it's at the Family Life Center still, but if you need legal advice, free legal advice, you're able to go there and receive that advice on any labor issues you may have. Carry your work contract if you need. If you're not sure, am I being taken advantage of? Are things according to law? Is my employer abusing me in some way? Is there some infraction being taken place here? So please know your rights, and that's very important. Never be afraid. If you're a work permit holder or Caymanian, do not be afraid to also report these infractions to the Department of Labor and Pensions. And you can also call anonymously. They have it on their website. I think they have it on their Facebook page as well. If you're afraid to go in person or to call and identify yourself, please feel free to call their anonymous number and ask questions and get advice.
All right, we have time for just one more question. I'm trying to squeeze in as many questions as possible. I'm not the one answering them, but I will gladly ask them. This one, we had a couple regarding domestic helpers. So this one is asking, based on ESO data, are you saying that 3,620 people are making less than minimum wage when you calculate an hourly wage? And I guess part two of that question, does this figure include new mothers on maternity leave taking less pay?
But the data really is based on what persons reported as their usual pay per week, or per month, sorry, coming out of the 2021 census. And so in terms of the persons, that are what persons are saying that they earn, and based on what they earn, as well as they would indicate how many hours they work for that. And so that is used to calculate that hourly wage. In terms of mothers and maternity, there is a gray area in that it's dependent on how that respondent interprets and answers the question. If the person is still getting their normal wage, they would naturally report it as such, and so it wouldn't affect or wouldn't negatively skew the data in terms of what that mother reports. If it's a mother who, while being on maternity for 3 or 4 months, is not being paid, and they choose to report that, well, they're not getting that money for that period, then they wouldn't be calculated as getting a wage. And so it's really based on what persons report as their usual hours worked and what they usually get paid for that work.
And the 3,600 is at the minimum wage, not below.
Well, so to qualify, that 3,620, that's an excellent point, Shomari, is for persons up to slightly above the minimum wage. I believe it's $6.19. So it pretty much captures persons at or below the minimum wage, and not necessarily all those persons below. There's a persons who are just slightly above, but they would still be below that vulnerability at least.
Sure.
To correct myself, it was legal befrienders. The name was on the tip of my tongue, and I was like, who are they again? Legal befrienders.
Last question. Is the committee able to give any indication of a final recommendation of a minimum wage?
If I'm understanding the question is, have we made a decision?
Or are you able to give any indication of a final recommendation?
No. The answer to that is
Soon
definitely no.
Soon come.
Not at this time.
As Shomari said, soon come. And on that note, we are out of time. Thank you to our panelists for this engaging town hall today. Thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in, whether on Radio Cayman, CIGTV, Facebook, or YouTube. Thank you. And just one more public consultation meeting will be held in Cayman Brac. That will take place on Thursday, September 7th at the Aston Ruddy Center at 6 p.m. Remember, questions and feedback can be sent to minimumwage@gov.ky. Thank you all for joining. I'm Shanda Gallego. Until next time, take care and God bless.